In 2009, the CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, said, if you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. A decade later, and the company's messaging on privacy had drastically changed, and Google planned to deprecate third-party cookies. Last week, the company U-turned. So I'll be asking whether UK regulators were behind this decision. I'm also going to look at the FTC's latest blog post in which it says hashing does not anonymize data. Is that obvious, or have they maybe overstated it? And finally, New York's Attorney General has made some very bold assertions about what companies should and should not do when collecting cookie data. Where's the underlying law for these assertions in New York? I'm Robert Bateman. Thank you to Privado AI for their support. This is the Privacy Corner. So first up, as mentioned, Google has scrapped its plans to deprecate third-party cookies, which would have effectively eradicated them from the web. Chrome holds about a 60% market share of browsers, and a lot of companies still rely on third-party data for marketing and so on. So the Privacy Sandbox, in case you didn't know, is a Google-led set of projects that aimed to reduce the scope of fingerprinting. It had a new ad targeting mechanism called Topics, which would target people on browser rather than sending lots of data to lots of different companies, and also involved getting rid of third-party cookies in Chrome. Other companies had done this years ago. Safari, Brave, Firefox, third-party cookies off by default in those browsers. But when Google sneezes, the industry catches a cold because of the company's market presence. And that appears to be one of the reasons that Google is putting this project on hold. They cite two regulators in this blog post from the VP responsible for the Privacy Sandbox, the UK's Competition and Markets Authority and the Information Commissioner's Office. Now, the ICO has said it's quite disappointed by Google's plans not to turn off third-party cookies, and the messaging from the ICO has always been largely supportive of this idea, perhaps unsurprisingly, because I think it would be a net benefit for privacy, the Topics API, as opposed to the current kind of messy digital advertising ecosystem. But the CMA has been really breathing down Google's neck for a number of years on this. They really have been very, very rigorous in trying to find out what's going on with this project because of pressure from other players in the ad tech industry, from publishers, all of whom would lose access to a lot of third-party data. Google delayed its plans a number of times after making promises to the CMA, and perhaps the CMA have finally ground the company down into delaying this, shelving it indefinitely. So the approach from here on appears to be, well, they talk about an informed choice. So that could be, for example, allowing people to choose between topics, third-party cookies, or nothing. That would be a truly informed choice if it's implemented in the right way. Google, of course, would not ideally like to give clear consent, I would imagine, but I think this mechanism will probably be pre-approved in some markets, possibly the UK. They also talk about introducing IP protection into Chrome Incognito. That might be to do with a settlement this year about deleting billions of records of people's private browsing data gleaned from incognito sessions. Next up, the US Federal Trade Commission has published a blog called No Hashing Still Doesn't Make Your Data Anonymous. And they make some pretty bold claims in this post. For example, data is only anonymous when it can never be associated back to a person. I think that goes further than the CJEU's interpretation in cases like Breyer. But nonetheless, they make some very good points, and it's fair enough to say that hashing per se doesn't make your data anonymous, but can it? So in the recent blog post, the FTC links back to a 2012 article by its then chief technologist, Ed Felton, and he talks even then about how hashing is vastly overrated as a so-called anonymization technique. I thought I would put this to the test by hashing my credit card number using a commercially available hashing app. So here it is at the bottom. I use SHA1 encoding. And if you have that hash value, you can't simply reverse it and discover my credit card number. But if you generate a list of every possible credit card numbers and you compare that hash to one of the items on the list, you will eventually find it and therefore know which credit card number it is associated with. This is how companies and baddies identify who is behind a hashed piece of data. It's called a rainbow table attack. Now, of course, that is not really my credit card number. That is the hash of the input. Of course, this isn't actually my credit card number. Ed Felton did a similar little gag in his blog post. And I think the point is that hashes can be anonymous if there's no way of, or if it's very unlikely perhaps, that they can be associated with their input values. There is a very interesting discussion in the comments under the post, back from when the FTC allowed such things, between Dan Kaminsky, who sadly died in 2021, a security researcher, and Peter Swire, a well-known Georgia Tech privacy professor. And they discuss whether hashing can indeed make things anonymous using salts. Kaminsky suggests that salt is not meaningful as a way to keep hashes secret because, again, the same principle applies. If you know the salt and you know the input, then you know what the hash refers to. It's not necessarily an improvement because it's just an extra piece of data. If someone knows that piece of data, then they have the kind of secret to the hash's input. Peter Swire says, in practice in industry, there may be lots of employees who see a hashed social security number. There is a salt that is unknown to these employees. So if you don't know the salt, then of course you probably can't sort of reverse engineer the hash in the way I described previously. The secret here, I think, or the key is if you're using a piece of data, regardless of what it is, to track someone, to identify them or single them out, then it's not an anonymous piece of data. Finally, in New York, the Office of the Attorney General has published some guidance for businesses and consumers about cookie banners and implementations of tracking technology. Now, New York has tried for many years running to pass a privacy law, a comprehensive privacy law that would regulate tracking and cookies and those sorts of things, but it's failed to do so. This state does not have a comprehensive privacy law, but this guidance is based on consumer protection law, much like the FTC does. It interprets that in a way that gives rise to some pretty strict rules about what businesses may and may not do online. So this guidance focuses mostly on not making misleading statements about tracking, which is squarely in the Edict of Consumer Protection Law. But some of this stuff is not uncontroversial, even in countries where the GDPR and the e-privacy directive apply. So, for example, the AG talks about uncategorized or miscategorized tags and cookies. If you're using a consent management platform, make sure all the tags are correctly categorized and also give consumers the opportunity to opt out or into granular categories of tags. Next, they provide some examples of what they consider to be good and bad cookie pop-ups. These two are presented as confusing. So we have one that is really quite typical, customize my choices. One that just says accept with no opt-out. These are very common, particularly in the US. And I think some businesses might push back about being told that they are not acceptable. Furthermore, the guidance says that if consumers can agree to tracking with a single click, let them decline with a single click. Now, of course, I would love it if websites did that, but even in the EU, many of them don't, and some DPAs don't even think they are required to. They also talk about making sure accept and decline buttons have equal size, color, and emphasis. So this is really quite a strict interpretation of even cookie and privacy-related law, let alone consumer protection law that does not mention cookies or tracking. So that's all from me this week. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And thank you again to Privado AI. I'll see you next week.